This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Laurie. I really appreciate it. Thank you again to our sponsors for making this possible, and to all of you for taking time out of what I know are busy, active lives to come and listen to this presentation tonight. I hope that you'll enjoy a trip through a mind flight of topics that are things that we now know about the human mind. This is a subset of the things that we know, of course, about the human mind. We're just going to sample a little bit. And these are also the three topics that we're going to hit on in some depth are topics that are of relevance to us in our everyday lives, right? So in my time at the Air Force Research Laboratory and throughout my career, I've done research at the intersection of basic and applied research. A lot of that basic research is, primarily of interest to scientists who are down in the weeds of the details of mechanism and that kind of thing. Doesn't always have obvious application in our lives, but the subset of things that we're going to talk about tonight will. I'm going to describe to you a little bit about my personal and professional history, how we got to where we are today, and as we begin to make our way through that and finish off a little bit of a background, then we'll start into our mind flight. And I see some of you, at least, are enjoying a nice glass of wine right now. So perhaps you had an opportunity for an impromptu flight right before the lecture started. That would be wonderful, probably advisable. So, as Laurie mentioned, one of my degrees is in psychology, my bachelor's degree at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. And as I finished off my bachelor's degree, I was looking for pretty much anything that I could do that would involve the use of that degree. And I had the wonderful opportunity, the great fortune, to land a summer internship at one of the Air Force bases in San Antonio, at Brooks Air Force Base, where there was a laboratory that was accepting summer interns sponsored by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And I had an opportunity during that summer to work with some preeminent scientists in areas associated with personnel selection and placement and cognitive processing and learning. I got the chance to work with Ray Crystal, who's one of the founders of the Big Five personality theory. I got the opportunity to work with Pat Killinan, who was running a large research laboratory in personnel, new innovative ways to select and place personnel for the Department of Defense. And he has gone on from there subsequently to an active career at the Educational Testing Service, ETS. Having done that summer internship, I then was even more fortunate to subsequently land a research assistant position working in intelligent tutoring systems with the Air Force, just across town on the other side of, moving from southeast to southwest San Antonio over at Lackland Air Force Base. And there I worked with Valerie Shute on student modeling algorithms to investigate the opportunities for adaptive training systems and education systems for the Air Force. That combination of experiences in those Air Force laboratories provided me examples of the fact that there are people in the world who are working at that very exciting bidirectional space between basic and applied research, right? Doing some scientific discovery and looking for ways to use that. And when we aren't sure that we have all of the right science in place in order to do the things that we want to do in the applied research, then that motivates new investigation on the basic side, right? And that's what I mean by that bidirectional relationship. It's not a one-way street. These two activities inform each other. It was these experiences that convinced me that cognitive science was the direction that I wanted to go in my career. And from there, I applied to an assortment of cognitive psychology and cognitive science graduate programs, and I ended up at Carnegie Mellon with, again, enormous fortune. This is a theme with me. It's just one fortunate series of events and circumstances after the next. I've led an incredibly fortunate life. So off to Carnegie Mellon to work with John Anderson. The reason was that he was running one of the most active intelligent tutoring systems laboratories in the world at the time. He was at a transition point in his career where he was beginning to move back from a focus on intelligent tutoring systems and testing his theories of human cognitive processing and back to a focus on the fundamental cognitive architecture. Again, that bidirectional space between the basic research and the applied research. And John Anderson also has spent some time with feet in both of those camps in his career. So I did my master's and PhD there. This is what I thought Pittsburgh was like at the time. Now, I grew up mostly in South Texas, right, and went to college in San Antonio, and I had never been to Pittsburgh. But when I said to people, I'm going to go to graduate school in Pittsburgh, this is basically what they would describe to me. Oh, right, that sounds terrible. You're going to go hang out in this dark, gloomy, soot-filled steel town for the next several years while you toil away in some basement laboratory. Okay, sounds awful. Well, it turns out Pittsburgh's really not like that at all. Certainly not anymore, maybe 70 years ago, right? But no, it's a wonderful city. Enormously enjoyed the time there. And after finishing off graduate school, went to work, not too surprisingly, I suppose, at the Air Force Research Laboratory, joining a training research division in Arizona, where we were investigating an assortment of ways to try to improve on both training and educational processes and outcomes for the Air Force, right? We have an enormous array of different career fields within our military services, not exclusively the Air Force, but to include the Air Force. And we want them to be as good as possible in their jobs, and we want to get them to high levels of proficiency quickly. And we want to help them maintain that proficiency as high as possible for as long as possible. So those were the kinds of objectives that we were pursuing in the training research division. And as Lori mentioned, I spent nearly 25 years, and if we include graduate school, my assortment of research efforts goes back over 25 years with the Air Force and graduate school included. I'm not going to read this list to you. You can see there's a list of research topics there. It turns out when you work for 25 years and you're working a lot and you're working hard and you build a team of people to pursue these different research agendas, you can cover quite a bit of ground. And so we pursued work across this range of topics. I'm going to come back to this as we down select from this to our mind flight in a few minutes. General Goldfein made this statement back in 2017, which serves to emphasize the importance of cognitive sciences in the evolving military environment, right? Transitioning from wars of attrition to wars of cognition. And this is a transition that continues, and the wars of cognition include both human and machine cognition, which is among the reasons why I'm so excited to be at a place like the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, because we need human cognition and machine cognition working effectively together to continue to provide us the advantages that we need to make sure that we remain a secure and free society and that we're able to promote that around the world. But of course, cognition is central to all human endeavor, right? Certainly not exclusive to military service. So we see a central role for cognitive processing, both on machine sides and on human sides, in transportation, in exploration, in healthcare, in sports, right? Where there's an increasing emphasis and appreciation of the fact that, particularly in team sports, but in other forms of sport as well, it's important to improve on our decision-making processes. Right? And so I remain enthusiastic about the fact that I am a cognitive scientist and that I have the opportunity to pursue research and development to help improve cognition. The Cognitive Science Society is the world's preeminent organization devoted to understanding the human mind and adopts a diverse, multidisciplinary approach to that. And you can see the set of disciplines listed around the perimeter of this logo, right? From artificial intelligence and education to philosophy and anthropology and others, right? It takes a diverse set of disciplines in order to make progress on these challenges, on developing that comprehensive, deep understanding of what it means to have mind and how we can help mind affect positive change and exist productively in the world. And within cognitive science, we ask a variety of research questions that span all of those fields and intersections among them, right? And here's a sampling of the kinds of questions, not just that I have asked, but that people from around the cognitive science community have asked, that are at the foundation and the forefront of improving our understanding of mind. There's an enormously diverse set of methods that get used within the cognitive sciences, right? From direct observation to experimentation, controlled studies, using high-density data measures like eye tracking and verbal protocol analysis and brain imaging to get at internal process and understand the atomic structure and the microstructure of what's happening as people are doing things like learning and thinking, right? Using their minds. And we use advanced mathematics and statistics, computational systems, and modeling and simulation in order to create and simulate the kinds of processes that we're interested in order to demonstrate that we do in fact have an improving understanding of what those processes are. Paul Rosenblum has suggested that computing, right, which is there's a collection of methods that I mentioned at the bottom of the previous slide that are all part of the computing enterprise, that computing is in fact a fourth great scientific domain. So when we think about the sciences, right, broadly speaking, we often refer to, and we're accustomed to thinking about the sciences from the perspective of the physical sciences, the life sciences, and the social sciences, right? Well, Paul Rosenblum has suggested, in fact, computing itself as a coherent, distinctive, and extensive body of structures and processes provides us a fourth great scientific domain. And computing intersects with all of these other domains productively, right? It's an interesting idea. It's traditionally not how we think about computing in the space of the sciences, right? There is a subdiscipline within computing that we refer to as computer science, but even that is relatively new, and we don't really think of that and its relationship with other components of computing science as part of a whole. But this is Rosenblum's proposal, and I would suggest that it's the case that the portfolio of research happening at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition is a portfolio that exists at the intersection of all four of these great scientific domains. And that's something for us to celebrate and recognize, right? It's challenging enough to work at the intersection of, say, two subdisciplines of one of these great scientific domains. Right? Challenging to work within any triad combination of three of these domains. To work at the intersection of all four is quite an endeavor. And it speaks to the importance of having an organization like IHMC productively contributing to our broad scientific mission and the scientific ecology around the world. I wanted to emphasize this point because there will be parts of the rest of the presentation where I touch on computing systems a little bit and some of the work that we've done in modeling. I wanted to provide this sort of broad scientific framing for you to think about how ideas from computing, modeling, simulation, analytics can contribute productively in the scientific mission to our understanding of what's happening within the social, biological, and life sciences. All right, so showed an earlier version of this that didn't have the highlights on the right as a description of the set of things that I've worked on over the course of my career. And now you can see the down select, right? So we are going to touch on some topics and some things that we've learned. Now, this is not exclusively things that I learned in my own research or that I learned in collaboration with people. I'm drawing from work in this area, right? Although we will mention here and there some of our own research findings and contributions to our understanding of these areas. So we're going to touch on fatigue effects. We're going to touch a little bit on robust decision making, and we're going to touch on learning and memory dynamics. We're going to do it in the reverse order. Starting with learning and memory, make our way to robust decision making, and then finally sleep, fatigue, and cognition. All right. So to make the metaphor really concrete. All right, we'll start into a little bit of discussion about learning and memory. So there is a huge literature within the cognitive sciences about learning and memory. Much has been learned over the course of the past century and a half or so about the dynamics of human learning and the frailties and potential strengths of the forgetting that happens within our memory systems. We are going to try to not make this serious and boring, and we'll try to make it a fun trip through learning and memory research, but in a way that teaches you a little bit about some of what we've learned about these dynamics and what the implications might be for the way that we think about our own learning opportunities, okay? So one of the things that became immediately apparent when I started with the Air Force Research Laboratory and through interaction with colleagues in the other service laboratories and working in industry and across various academic departments is that it turns out, disappointingly, there's a collection of antiquated training methods that still dominate in the world today. These include checklists that require you to review some material, right? Be exposed to it in some form or another, right? And then you get that checked off, and the assumption is, well, now it's learned. And usually the assumption is that it's learned for some period of time into the future, right? So this is extremely common with certification and licensing processes, right? So you do a training course, maybe it lasts an hour, maybe it lasts a day or a week, whatever. And then your certification or licensing is good for whatever period of time some authority has determined that it should be good for. Maybe that's a month, or more commonly it's a year or two, something like that. And before your certification runs out, now you need to go and check that box again, right? Make sure you've been exposed to the information associated with that training. Well, these methods assume completely unrealistic memory dynamics, and that although they'll never acknowledge that this is the assumption that they're making, underlying any kind of a universally applied certification or licensing process is an assumption that looks something like this. You have no proficiency in whatever it is until you do your training session. And then all of a sudden, let me see if I can get this going. All of a sudden, at the completion of that session, you are perfectly proficient. So you have made a categorical jump from no proficiency to complete proficiency, and now you're good to go, right? So for whatever time it is that you're assumed to be licensed or certified or whatever, your knowledge is assumed to be there. You're going to hit some point in the calendar in the future, and the day before that or the hour before that, you're completely proficient, and then all of a sudden you have a catastrophic loss of knowledge and understanding and skill, and now suddenly you don't have that anymore, right? And you're no longer allowed to do the things that you were allowed to do yesterday because you've timed out on your proficiency profile. And so now you've got to do your checkbox thing again and then get back to perfectly proficient, right? Well, I mean, on the face of it, everybody, you're laughing and smiling because you know that's ridiculous, right? We all know it's ridiculous. And we can do much better. So here are some characteristic memory curves that are representative. These are caricatures, of course, but these are representative of learning processes and forgetting processes, right? There is scientific debate about whether these are best characterized mathematically as power functions or exponential functions or whatever. Maybe it's the case that at an individual level, this should be characterized as an exponential function, but when we average across people, it's more of a power function, that sort of thing. We don't have to worry about the mathematical details of that here. We do in the scientific publications. But for purposes of this presentation, we're not going to worry about that debate. The important thing is, in general, it's the case, as you're learning something new, you're going to tend to acquire that knowledge or proficiency with repetition. So these are practice opportunities across the bottom here. You're going to tend to acquire that relatively quickly, and then it gets harder and harder to gain additional proficiency. You have to work really hard, more and more difficult to move incrementally up the proficiency or accuracy or correctness dimension here, right? So to get really good at something, you have to put in enormous effort, right? To know it cold, that takes a lot of effort. Similarly, on the forgetting side, it turns out once we start or once we stop practicing or training or rehearsing or whatever, it starts to decay away, right? And knowledge and skill decays quickly at first, and then the rate of loss of that slows over time, right? So these are referred to as the learning curve and the forgetting curve, right? Again, a caricature, but this is a decent description of, in general, what we see. There are other worthwhile memory dynamics to know about. One of them is the spacing effect. And so the spacing effect is a phenomenon in which if we take exactly the same amount of training opportunities, so these are all learning sessions, the S's on the bottom are learning sessions, and on this blue curve here, we're spacing that learning out over sessions. And on the red curve over here, we're doing all the same amount of training in a very compressed period of time, right? There's no spacing. We're sort of doing a training session, do a training session, do a training session, just like that. It turns out across many different studies and many different kinds of domains and different sorts of material, that if you space your learning out over time, you retain that knowledge better, right? You show a slower forgetting profile afterwards. And so this phenomenon has clear implications for us in designing educational systems and training systems, right? If we want to improve the retention of material when we no longer have the opportunity to study it or practice it, then we should space our learning out more over time prior to that period in which we won't be able to do that practice. We'll retain that knowledge better. It turns out there also is a relearning effect. And this was something that we discovered internally in some of our own experimentation and modeling at the Air Force Research Laboratory. So we published this paper in 2018 that is the first published account of this phenomenon. And the relearning effect says, well, it acknowledges first that, well, sometimes it's going to be the case that we just haven't had an opportunity to study or practice for a while, and we will forget that information. We'll reach a point where we can't retrieve the knowledge that we were trying to retrieve before. That's going to happen in the human cognitive system. And the question that we were asking here was, well, when someone has reached that point with knowledge that they had previously, is there any advantage to having studied it originally in a spaced manner versus a massed practice? And it turns out there is. So not only will spacing your learning provide you a retention advantage relative to massed learning, but it also will help you relearn that material faster, right, on average, after you get the opportunity to study it again, all right? So yet another good reason to space your learning out over time when you have the opportunity to do that. We built this collection of dynamics into a collection of equations that we refer to as the predictive performance equations, and turned those equations into a technology called the predictive performance optimizer, which we patented and have available through the Air Force. So the Air Force holds the patent, both patents on the predictive performance optimizer. And we have systematically compared the performance of our predictive performance equations to collections of other equations that have been proposed by others in the field. And we find advantages for our approach versus the others, as you can see in the stoplight chart here, right? Where we have more green than they do. Right? And the message here is that is not that learning curves like the learning curve and the forgetting curve and the spacing dynamics and all of that are the only important thing in memory and learning, right? They're not the only important thing, but they are something that's important to know about. And it provides us an opportunity to think about how are we managing our own learning processes individually, and how are the organizations that we're associated with, how are they managing their training practices? Some additional relevant factors that I won't go deeply into within this presentation are effects of the meaningfulness of information and the degree to which you are encoding and thinking about that information in a self-relevant way when you're learning it, right? The emotionality of the information. It's often the case that we see better memory for events in our lives and things that we know when there is emotionality associated with them. And having multiple association pathways. So sometimes this is referred as deeper or a form of more meaningful processing, right? Thinking about things from a variety of different angles, thinking critically about them, generating relationships within your mind about information that you're learning and other things that you know. These all create additional neural pathways to facilitate the retrieval of memory, right? And so these are additional factors that you want to think about, and it's not all about me, of course, is a reference to the self-relevance and emotionality, but all of these are effortful, intentional ways that we can take some control over our own learning and the probability of retention of things that we want to learn and remember. All right, back to our mind flight. That wraps up our brief tour through some learning and memory phenomena. And let's talk about robust decision making. So I had the opportunity while I was at Air Force Research Laboratory to organize and lead a multidisciplinary set of people interested in the topic of robust decision making. One of the things that we faced was coming to an agreement on what robustness means, right? It turns out that when you get 30 or so people together from, say, 5 or 6 different technical directorates around the Air Force Research Laboratory, you're going to hear a lot of different interpretations of what people mean by robust, right? And we needed to settle this a bit first. It took an embarrassingly long period of time for us to reach some consensus among us on what we meant. In fact, reaching that consensus was facilitated by the fact that I had the opportunity to spend some time at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, as Laurie mentioned. And while I was there, I got the additional opportunity to participate in an event that was hosted there called a Strungman Forum, which brought people together to debate some, pressing open scientific issues. We arrived through the work that we did at that Strungman Forum at this definition, that robustness is the extent to which a system is able to maintain its function when some aspect of that system is subject to perturbation. And so the idea is whatever the system is, this could be a biological system, it could be an ecological system, it could be a cognitive system, an engineered system like a building, right? It could be an aircraft. It could be any form of system, but this is a very general interpretation of robustness that I think holds across any domain that you might be interested in, any kind of system that you can think of. And the idea is to have mechanisms within that system that provide it the capacity to do things like adapt, monitor its environment, have redundancy built into it. These are all mechanisms that produce robustness in any domain. And a key insight coming out of the discussions at that Strungman Forum, my work with colleagues at the Air Force Research Laboratory, is that it is important to understand that we exist in uncertain, dynamic, non-stationary environments. These adjectives describe the environments in which we live our everyday life, right? These are not descriptors that are only relevant to military operations or to emergency room doctors or whatever. In our everyday life, our environments are uncertain, dynamic, non-stationary. And because of that, those characteristics, provable optimization is impossible. Anytime you have somebody telling you that you can optimize X, Y, or Z in your life or work or whatever, and it's anything but the most trivial, ridiculously simple situation, you should keep a hand on your wallet and leave the room, okay? There is no proving optimization in those situations. Now, sure, it is possible to generate some functions or algorithms that are going to optimize some kind of a fit or a relationship within that system or whatever, but those same algorithms will not be useful for proving that whatever the characteristic is that you or they are trying to optimize has actually been optimized within the environment in which you want to use it, right? And because of the impossibility of optimizing in that way, the goal is not optimization. The goal is to be robust, right? The goal is to be as impervious as you can be to the things that are going to happen that you are unable to predict and that are perturbing you and your environment, right? These stressors are going to hit, and you want to be robust to them to the extent possible. All right. So this was the group that I worked with at the Max Planck Institute, the Adaptive Behavior and Cognition Research Group. They study decision-making under uncertainty. The Max Planck Institute groups evolve over time. They have a director who leads them. In this case, the director was Gerd Gigerenzer. Eventually, directors either time out or move on. In Gerd's case, he timed out, and so they refresh their research groups on a regular basis. So this group is no longer active, but there are follow-on groups that are building on the foundational work that the Adaptive Behavior and Cognition group did. So they study simple heuristics. This body of literature, and there's an example here on the screen. Simple heuristics that make us smart is one book out of a large set of books that have been produced by this research group and by Gerd Gigerenzer over the course of the last 30 years. So they study simple heuristics, and the point of the simple heuristics is to promote robustness in decision making. The idea is to intentionally leave some information out. Use as little information as possible in the context of the decision that you need to make in order to arrive at a decision or a course of action. And so they're fast and frugal. You have to do very little information integration and data integration, and you use very little, so they're frugal. And this allows for, in some situations at least, faster and more robust decision making. And they describe the collection of heuristics as a toolbox for the mind, right? That's the metaphor that they like. We have a collection of tools that are available to us in the form of decision heuristics. We can use those to improve on our own and others' decision making. Here's an example. How do people catch balls? So let's imagine somebody throws a baseball towards you or hits one off of a bat, and you're out in the outfield, you've got to close in on it. Or somebody throws a football to you or a volleyball, whatever. So one option would be, well, I'm going to carefully calculate the precise trajectory of this ball, and I'm going to factor in all of these dynamic environmental considerations like wind speed and air pressure, and I'm going to use all of that to precisely define the point in three-dimensional space where that ball is going to be at a moment in the future, and then I'm going to put myself there, right? So maybe that's what people do. Probably not. Maybe they use something more like the gaze heuristic. And the gaze heuristic simply says, fixate your eyes on the ball. Start running towards it. Adjust the speed of your running so that the angle to the ball is kept constant, right? And then it turns out you'll end up where the ball lands. So it looks something like this, just from a side view. I'm getting closer, same gaze angle, and I catch it, right? No fancy computation needed. No advanced degrees in physics, right? And so it's simple, it's fast, it's frugal. Just take one piece of information into account, the angle from your eye to the ball, and avoid the complex computation. This gaze heuristic approach has been described in a variety of other contexts besides catching balls or participating in sports. A number of different animals seem to use this kind of a heuristic to chase things in their environment that they're interested in chasing. We use it to avoid collisions, it turns out, in things like driving and sailing and flying. In fact, some of you may recall the Miracle on the Hudson from some years back, right? I mean, this was a particularly impressive example of decision-making under uncertainty and enormous stress, right? Both engines go out on takeoff out of the airport in New York, right? Sully manages to land the plane on the Hudson River, and no one's lives are lost, a couple of minor injuries, right? Hero, fantastic. Here's a quote from the co-pilot, Jeffrey Skiles. It's not so much a mathematical calculation as visual, in that when you're flying in an airplane, a point that you can't reach will actually rise in your windshield, and a point that you're going to overfly will descend in your windshield, right? So they were able to look out, they lose both engines, got to immediately assess what happened, make a decision. Where am I putting this aircraft? I've got all these people on board, I'm responsible for their lives, what am I doing with them? Can we get to an airport? There's several airports in the area. You look out the windshield. What's happening with those airports? Are they rising in the windshield or are they falling in the windshield? They're all rising in the windshield. We're not going to make it, right? It's a very quick decision process. Didn't take a lot of extensive calculation or coordination with air traffic control or anything like that. He knew within seconds, right? Going to find somewhere else. How about a river? Let's give that a shot. Here's another example of a heuristic. This one is called the recognition heuristic. The description is a little bit complicated, can be difficult to interpret, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. So the idea is, let's say you're trying to make a decision between two things, and you recognize one thing but not the other one, right? You can infer sometimes, not always, sometimes, that the object that you recognize has a higher value on whatever criterion it is that you're valuing at the moment. Right? So let's look at an example of this. I'm going to show you two cars. And the decision that you need to make is, which of these is the higher quality car? Right? Now, from where you're sitting, you probably can't see the badging on the cars, but I'm going to reveal to you that one of these is a Volkswagen and the other one is a Tata. All right. So which one is the higher quality vehicle? By show of hands, who wants to pick the Tata? Okay. Well, we got a few Tata fans. Did any of you of those of you who have your hands up, how many of you drive a Tata? Nobody, right? Yeah. All right. This example comes out of the German research lab at the Max Planck Institute. So, of course, the higher quality vehicle is the German vehicle. It's the Volkswagen. Which of these infections has more new incidents per year in Germany? More new incidents per year in Germany. Tuberculosis or leptospirosis? Okay. Sorry? No, I'm going to let you just make your own guess, internal to your mind. Tuberculosis or which one's more, another way to ask it, which one's more common in Germany? It turns out tuberculosis, right? By show of hands, how many people in the room know what leptospirosis is? We've got like about a dozen people, right? So how many people have heard of tuberculosis? Yeah, everybody, right? All right. So it turns out the recognition heuristic works pretty well in this example. Here's another. Same question, which is more common, which has more new incidents per year, shigellosis or leprosy? We've got some informed guessing happening. All right. Yeah, it turns out this time it's the shigellosis, right? So the same heuristic works in the one case but not in the other. And this is an important message, right? The important thing here is to appreciate that there is no decision process that always works. The same underlying assumptions and processes will fail you depending on the environment and the details of the specific question and the decision that you need to make. So in this case, recognition points to the wrong answer. So heuristics will work some of the time, and that's true of any decision process. Right? There's a variation on the recognition heuristic called the fluency heuristic, and this one says, what if I recognize both of them? Right? If I recognize them both, now I'm stuck unless I use the fluency heuristic, which says, well, if I recognize one more than the other, it feels more familiar to me. Let's go with that one. Right? It's a variation on it. Here's something called a default heuristic. This has big implications for our behavior on a large scale. So what we see here on the left side of the graph with the low participation rates in organ donation are a set of countries that default to non-participation as organ donors, so it's an opt-in approach. You're welcome to be an organ donor, but you have to opt in. We're going to assume you don't want to be an organ donor unless you make that clear. Very low participation rates in organ donation in those countries. On the right-hand side in the blue bars, we see countries that are opt-out countries, right? They default to, you're going to be an organ donor, and if you don't want to be an organ donor, you need to make that clear to us. You may opt out if you would like. And we see participation rates up, in the ballpark of 100% in most of those countries. Right? So that's a default heuristic, and the heuristic goes basically just keep doing whatever the default is, right? If there's not a very strong requirement to change my mind and take action against it, then just keep doing it. And then there's a type of heuristic called fast and frugal trees. And these are ways to arrive at decisions in complex situations. So this is an example of a context in which someone presents to, say, an emergency room, and there's some concern that they may be having a heart attack. You've got to decide what to do with them, right? Where do you place them within the hospital? What level of care do you want to provide? And this is a series of questions about the state of that person. In their EKG, do we see an ST segment change? Are they complaining of chest pain? Right? Do they have any other specific factor that we might be on the lookout for? And you can set up these fast and frugal trees intentionally to be more or less biased in one direction or another, right? Which you may want to do depending on the situation and the dynamic changes of what's going on in the hospital at any particular point in time. But this is a way to make quick decisions about things without needing to collect an enormous amount of data. And so the bottom line takeaway from these points is that there's no decision process that works perfectly for all contexts or for all people. The real world that we live in is too complex for optimization. And we should all take comfort in the fact that these fast, frugal heuristics that often come naturally to us, right, work well in many situations, right? So if you ever have any concern that maybe you're not thinking about enough different information about whatever decision it is that you're trying to make, stop fretting about that, right? You probably already have all the information you need. Make a decision, right? There's no guarantee that gathering more information is going to help, and it might hurt. All right. One last item for our mind flight, sleep fatigue and cognition. So this feels like a topic that is generally relevant to people, but just by way of kind of getting a read from the audience, have any of you ever been tired? Anyone ever felt like, maybe you're not at your best at the moment, right? Maybe you've been up for a long time, continuously. Anybody in the room ever feel like you did not get as much sleep as you needed last night? Right? Yeah, occasionally that happens, right? Okay. So obviously, this is a topic that we all struggle with. There are many reasons for this. We have lots of demands on our time and attention. We have lots of priorities that we try to juggle in our lives. There are things that need to get done, et cetera, et cetera. We have these wonderful inventions like the candle and the light bulb and the cell phone that it turns out are really good at keeping us awake longer, right? Providing stimulation for us so that we actually have more trouble falling asleep. So they have negative consequences. In the scientific literature about sleep, the researchers who study these things often talk about a two-process model. This is a bit of a caricature. It's a little bit of a simplification, but it's a fair one. It's a fair simplification. That in general, what we have going on is a sort of homeostatic decrement process, so that the longer that you've been awake, the more pressure you feel to get to sleep, right? And there is circadian variability associated with exposure to sunlight, especially, right? And so these two processes interact in order to produce an alertness profile that varies for us over time. And you can see here that as sleep deprivation accumulates over 20, 30, 50, 80 hours, imagine being in one of these experiments, by the way, right? You volunteer to come into a laboratory and be kept awake for 70, 80 hours, right? Being tested on a battery of cognitive activities every 3 or 4 hours for the entire time. It's challenging, to say the least. But as you can see, alertness, described here as throughput, on various cognitive measures degrades over the course of that period. And this has a collection of common consequences for us, right? Our accuracy and response time degrade, our attentional resources restrict, our ability to integrate information decreases, we have mood drops, our attitude gets sour, right? I mean, that happens to me if I just don't get a good night's sleep, right? But it gets worse and worse as the absence of sleep accumulates. And then when you get really, really tired, like in these very long sleep deprivation experiments, then you have what are called sleep attacks or involuntary lapses into sleep states. People will actually do this cognitively even though they have their eyes open. So they're doing a task, right, that they've been doing on this repeated interval, and they have their eyes open and they're looking at what is probably a computer screen. And the experimenter or research assistant is sitting there next to them, keeping an eye on them, making sure they're awake, because they're supposed to remain awake for the entire experiment, and they have their eyes open and they've gone totally unresponsive for 30 seconds or a minute. There's things happening in front of them and they have no idea, right? Because they're having a sleep attack. You just cannot stay awake anymore. It turns out that in performance studies associated with drunkenness or alcohol consumption and wakefulness or time deprived of sleep, we see very similar profiles. Now, I'll admit, these two graphs are on slightly different scales on the left, but not completely different scales, right? The effects that we see from 24 hours awake are the same cognitive effects that are seen when someone is legally drunk, right? Which is why it's a terrible idea to pull an all-nighter or do an operation of any sort continuously for 24 hours. So these dynamics have impacts in the real world that are really, truly consequential. All of these events from our history had sleep restriction or sleep deprivation identified as a component of the decision-making that led to the negative effect. Big negative impact. And these data, this was published back in 2006, drowsiness as a factor in 22 to 24% of all crashes and near crashes. Actually saw a crash like this happen as I was driving down the highway a few years ago. All right? Somebody fell asleep at the wheel, drove right off the road, flipped their car over. The car in front of me, right? Everybody stops, we get out, the person was okay, thank goodness, right? Nobody was injured in this accident, wearing a seatbelt. What happened? I fell asleep, just straight up. So it's not just about total sleep deprivation either. We talked briefly a moment ago about chronic sleep restriction, right? Not getting enough sleep. Most of us do this to some degree on a regular basis. We don't get the sleep that we need. And you can see in terms of lapses in performance on a sensitive measure of cognitive processing that even with restricting sleep down to, say, 5 hours a night for a variety of days in a row, you get a really undesirable increase in the probability that your cognitive system is not really functioning the way it needs to anymore. So we drink coffee, right? I'm not getting the sleep that I need, so I'll just stimulate myself and everything will be fine. Well, it turns out, maybe. Coffee is a stimulant, and there are other stimulants that can be taken to promote alertness or wakefulness, at least for a little while. But that's a risky game to play, right? And there's an onset-offset period for all of these stimulants, and we're very bad at monitoring that ourselves, right? And so it's important not to think of the fact that you drink some coffee or take some other stimulant as a substitute for a decent night's sleep. So a few recommendations for good sleep habits. Do have a consistent sleep-wake schedule, right? Having a pattern to that can be important. Do get adequate sleep on a regular basis. Just allow yourself the luxury of a cognitive system that is not negatively impacted by the fact that you didn't get enough sleep. Right? And creating a dark, quiet, cool environment is helpful for sleep. I'd recommend not consuming caffeine past noon. That recommendation is a little bit sensitive to when it is that you anticipate that you're going to sleep, right? People go to sleep at different times. But basically, you want whatever stimulants you're taking to make their way out of your body so that you can get a decent night's sleep. Smoking cigarettes or using alcohol just before you go to sleep, or as in the case of alcohol, as a sleep aid, also a bad idea. Doesn't actually help that much. You might be asleep, but you're not getting the benefit from the sleep that you would be if you hadn't drunk the alcohol. So some key takeaways from our mind flight today. With respect to learning and memory, you should process things meaningfully and space your learning over time. That's going to aid retention of that material, and if you happen to forget it, when you have an opportunity to go back and restudy it, you'll learn it faster again. Right? Be comfortable with the idea that simple heuristics for making decisions in our lives can improve robustness. And make sleep a priority. Get more sleep. It's one of the best things that you can do for your overall health, mood, and certainly your cognitive functioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was awesome. So I'm sure that there are some questions from this. We'll take a few questions. I have to recognize this young gentleman who I just met tonight. He is a student at FAU. Student at FAU, and drove 4.5 hours here just to come to this lecture tonight and to visit IHMC.
This is pretty cool. So the question I had really quickly is that whenever I think about redundancies in a system, so in the case of memory, I think the way you can kind of describe it is the amount of orthogonality you have in it. So for example, if you have a point of failure in a memory, there's some missing context, right? That if you have an emotion or a set of emotions associated with it, and a color and a sound and a sensation and other abstract context to it, that would act as a redundancy, so that if you're missing one point somewhere, you can derive it from the others. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how many people are taking that aspect, specifically the emotion aspect, in robotics, if that's something you know about.
Specifically in robotics?
Well, cognitive robotics.
Okay, all right. So my guess is, and I am not a roboticist, but I do work in an organization where there are roboticists. I think my guess is that there is no one within robotics who's intentionally taking that approach, right? It is probably the case, at least not in the way that you're describing. And I'll just point out that to get into the weeds of this just a little bit, you use the term orthogonality. That can be interpreted kind of like robustness in a collection of different ways. So I would say that it's not crucial for improvements in memory and having additional retrieval pathways for the memories to be formally, mathematically orthogonal, right? There's a mathematical interpretation of this that would be a kind of a strict orthogonality. I don't think that's crucial at all. What you want are a collection of potential associative pathways. And I think that you're hitting on the kind of key point that you're asking about there with respect to having the multiple representations, multiple pathways for action and interpretation and deciding within robotics is certainly a means of achieving more robust memory systems. Yeah.
Okay. That was quite a first question to start with.
We do have a question back in the back.
Back in the back. Do we have a hand up back here so I can see you? Oh, sir.
Thank you. Back in COVID times, it's said that an awful lot of young children lost a year of school, and they'll pay for that for many years to come. I wonder if there's any research that would have recommended a better approach to their being absent from school, some other learning technique that might have been used, different from just old-fashioned distant learning.
So that is as you may appreciate, a very complex question about whether there was a better approach. And I think and answering that at a comprehensive societal scale would involve some distinctions between where exactly we were in the emergence of the pandemic and what we understood about the dynamics of this virus, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's fascinating that you pose the question through a lens of old-fashioned distance learning, right? Given that there are so many places within the world, and even in the United States, where distance learning is still a pretty new concept and process, right? I think there is no question that we can do better in our distance learning and within our educational system more generally by appreciating the kinds of memory dynamics that I was describing here tonight and building that into the design of curricula, right, and process for education. There is surprisingly little attention to that today at a large scale within the educational system. There are organizations, companies, researchers who are actively working to address that. So just two examples that I know of, because I'm kind of tangentially connected to them through my research history. There's a company called Carnegie Learning that does intelligent tutoring systems for mathematics that was co-founded by my graduate school advisor and others as an application of cognitive theory in the world today. And they're headquartered in Pittsburgh and actively developing and continuing to refine curricula for math education within around the world, but especially in the United States. Millions of students every day use their systems. It's an adaptive instructional system around the individual skills of the individual learner, which is wonderful. We should do more of that. There's a very new company called Memory Lab in the Netherlands that's been created by some other colleagues within the cognitive science community. And they are specifically specializing in adaptive fact learning systems. So they have a very general methodology. They're not exclusively working within the area of mathematics, but some of their work includes mathematics. But they have an approach that seems to be very promising with respect to adaptive fact learning in general. And if you're interested in some more about that, I recommend you check out Memory Lab. Yeah.
Are there any more questions here in the back? Oh, here's one. Okay. Here you go, ma'am. I'm going to toss this.
Okay, there's all kinds of ways that driving is headed toward being more of a safe thing. Our niece put her biomedical engineering degree to work to design better car seats. That's her career.
Awesome.
We have self-driving cars down the road, on the road. How about the idea of not being able to drive if you are drunk and not being able to drive if you are overly tired? Is that happening at all, if you're fatigued?
Yeah, so that is happening in sort of isolated cases, situations, exploratory application of technology. And so there are systems that in some cases, for instance, for people who have multiple DUI convictions and so forth, they have to breathe into a breathalyzer in order for the car to start, as an example. I think that some kind of sensing technology that could detect drunkenness prior to a car starting, personally, my feeling is that's a great idea. Sure, people should not be driving drunk, absolutely. And we would, we would protect society that way. We would protect ourselves. Right? So I think that's a nice idea. There are systems that have been developed to detect sleepiness. So these tend to be off-body camera-based systems that are looking for eyelid closure, right? Which, when you don't have someone sitting there prompting you to be awake, is typically what happens when you start to fall asleep, right? Your eyelids get droopy, and they can detect that, and then they do some alerting. So there is some progress in this direction, but it would be great to see more. Yeah.
I have two questions. One here. We'll get Rich, I see you. I'll get you over there.
You mentioned not to take alcohol to sleep or other kinds of things. Has there been any studies done? I mean, we know the older we get, sleep is more elusive. Has there been anything done with medical marijuana? Any studies?
I do not work in that area, and I don't know that literature well. But my understanding is that it has been challenging because of the classification of marijuana for there to be, sort of many larger scale studies of the use of marijuana for a variety of different purposes. I'm confident that there has been some study of marijuana as a potential sleep aid and of the effects of the consumption of marijuana, THC, on sleep architecture, what happens within your mind while you're sleeping and whether or not you're getting the recovery and regenerative benefits of that. But I don't know that literature well. Yeah.
That's me.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk, very interesting. I'm interested in if you are studying memory apart from cognition, just our past memories and how to retain that.
Could you elaborate a little bit on memory apart from cognition?
Apart from learning, I guess I should say. Just maintaining our memories and, not declining in why did I go in that room to get that? And that kind of memory, or what did I do 3 days ago, or that kind of thing.
Yes. Okay. Now I understand your question. Thanks for the elaboration. So the form of learning that you're referring to there is what cognitive scientists would refer to as episodic memory, episodic learning, right? So as we go about our lives, things are happening, and we encode and retain some of them, right? The things that we're doing, the things that we see and experience, right? So we have these episodic memories that we accumulate over time. There is research about the dynamics of some of those, and they're subject to some of the same factors that I referred to previously, right? So the emotionality of memory, right? The degree to which you invest any time in elaborative thinking about that episode or event in your life, right? There's something called flashbulb memories that people refer to. These are extremely salient events that appear to be perfect recollections of things that happened. Does anybody in the room have something that they might think of as a flashbulb memory? Something you definitely remember, where you were, what you were doing, when this extremely important event happened in your life, right? Yeah. People are saying 9/11 and think, right? So, yes. So there are events. It used to be thought that these flashbulb memories were actually sort of photographic recordings in the mind of exactly the situation that you were in, everything in perfect memory. It turns out that is extremely rare. What actually happens, it seems, is that people have vastly improved memory for these things, and it appears to be because of a combination of factors associated with that event being very meaningful to them personally. It felt impactful, or it was impactful to them personally, and they spent a lot of time talking with others about it and remembering that event, right? So then you end up with a bunch of rehearsals and repetition over time of this thing that happened that was very meaningful and interesting to you, and so you've thought about it a lot. It's sort of like a study process, right? And so these episodic memories have a slightly different flavor, perhaps, in terms of their content than fact learning in mathematics or whatever, but most of the same mechanisms and dynamics are still relevant.
Thank you. That episodic sounds a lot like my kids on how they remember their childhood. But the heuristic, getting to the heuristic thing, it's not so much not doing all those calculations, really. It's more about not letting your conscious mind accept that whole formula thing and just let your unconscious mind develop that, right? Like the guy running for the ball, he's doing all sorts of calculations without really realizing it, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. What is it? So your statement is a person running after a ball is doing all kinds of calculations. Well, what's the evidence for that?
He's able to get to the ball.
Yeah.
So you're assuming that requires calculation.
Right.
Yeah. Of what sort? Does it require some kind of information processing to be taking place? I would say absolutely. There's no question. Might it be the case that some of that information processing includes some kind of calculation? Maybe. I'd be less convinced. I'd like to see what the evidence is for that from people who are doing that. But I think the general point that you're making is that there are, and I'm going to layer a little bit of interpretation into your question here, that there are things that our minds are doing that we don't have conscious access to, right? That is absolutely true, for sure. And so an aspect of what I was describing with the ball catching example is definitely that that we would assume that there is no conscious, intentional calculation that's taking place on the part of this person. Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes, I was just curious, when it comes to these different memories and having different connections, making them stronger, easier to access, just curious if it's possible for them to be represented as like actual node groups with different connections having different edge weights to be able to actually kind of analyze that mathematically?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that can be done. So this audience member is asking a particular sort of formal methodological question about the representation of these kinds of processes. So there's a variety of different types of representational formalisms that could be adopted in order to support some modeling, simulation analysis of these knowledge structures. And so that you've proposed an example methodology for how that can be done, and I think certainly, yep.
So y'all, we're going to have to close down questions now at this time, but I would like to, again, please thank Kevin for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks.